Hello and welcome to Zelf on the Shelf. I'm here with one of my favorite human beings in the whole world,
Blush.
Michael Adam Ferguson. And we've got some interesting things that I think will be pertinent and inspiring to a lot of people who watch our stuff. Michael, why don't you give us a little introduction about yourself, what you do, how you got to be here in the living room of an apostate.
You know, it's been a long journey. I grew up LDS like many of you wonderful people. Very devout, went on a mission, went to Brigham Young University. Unlike perhaps a lot of listeners, I spent about a decade in conversion therapy. So efforts to change your sexual orientation from gay to straight. And it's pertinent to the topics we're discussing today because spending so much time trying to understand my mind and the operations of my mind actually led me on what became a very interesting professional path. Fast forwarding to the present, I'm a neuroscientist at Cornell University. Specifically, I do research at the intersections of cognition and neuroscience. So really wanting to understand how it is that individual differences in brain activity result in individual differences in mental activity. Some of my research right now is related to the neural basis of intelligence. So what are more intelligent brains doing that less intelligent brains are not doing? And then probably more notably, I've been doing research on religiosity. So what's happening inside of the brain when individuals who are very religious are having experiences that they report to be transcendent, communal with the divine. And that research has gotten quite a bit of attention as of late.
Cool, yeah, if you haven't seen it yet, he gave a TED Talk here in Salt Lake called This Is Your Brain on God.
That's correct.
And it's really fascinating to hear about your work with that, and so check that out. We'll put a link in the description so you can see that. As far as your personal faith well, first of all, with conversion therapy, I'm sure that all of that was its own faith issue. And when did you officially leave the church, and when did that line up with accepting your homosexuality? And
it went in stages. I would say when I was about 28 years old was when I really started stepping away from the LDS church, but not directly because of LGBT conflict with Mormon doctrine. This is an entirely separate line of conversation. It was actually because I was trying so hard to establish a more secure faith and commitment to the restored gospel that I started digging into the Joseph Smith papers and digging into primary source documents, like really in good faith believing that I will find the visionary accounts that just resolve all of my hang-ups spiritually. And I found some other kind of visionary accounts in the process. So I didn't hop out of the Mormon ship and into the gay ship right away. I hopped out of the Mormon ship and into the Catholic ship, and I was like, this is ritualistically fun.
I didn't know that, but that explains some fun things about you.
yeah. And then I hopped into the Greek Orthodox ship, and then
did you officially join them, or were you just kind of associating, attending?
I was taking the catechism. I was going to the classes with the priests in preparation for baptism. The Greek Orthodox priest in Salt Lake was actually really cool, and he was like, I don't care that you're gay. I was like, what? Right. I was like, I won't tell this to too many people because I'm pretty sure the Orthodox still aren't on board with, you know. So
well, that's kind of fun. Is because I've heard from a lot of Mormons, when a gay person leaves the church, they just want it to be gay, and it's like, okay, well that's a good enough reason for anyone to leave the church to be themselves. That's fine. Yeah. But there also is an element of it's not always just that the people I associate with more often than not has been that same situation of trying to figure things out. Yeah. And the Greek Orthodox guy was cool with that.
He was. I don't know that the whole community would have been, but the priest was. And then this was also interesting. So I also approached a Catholic priest because there was a sign outside of the Catholic Church that said, "Want to be baptized?" ? Come on in. And I was like, all right. And so I talked to him and I said, here's the thing, like, I'm gay, and like I've tried for a long time to change that, and that's not changing. So if that's a condition for getting baptized into the RCC, as they call it in the insider lingo, the Roman Catholic Church, then this won't work. And he was like, no, that's never a reason to deny someone from Christ's banquet table. And I was like, what? I was like, Catholics are cooler than I thought.
Wow.
But turns out that I came back the following week, and like his superior had put the kibosh on it. So I'm not Catholic. The moral of the story is I'm not Catholic.
The one thing that stood in your way, you could have been the next pope.
I was thinking along those lines, right? We all had that fantasy where it's like, I will just infiltrate the ranks of the high priesthood.
Yeah.
And
I think everyone who maybe not everyone, only like the narcissists like me, who kind of like before leaving the church, they're like, what if I just like stuck around and like worked my way up through the system and changed things, and then you're like, I would not have the tolerance. I'd end up shooting myself in the head. I couldn't do that.
And yet, don't you think that guy or those guys are there? Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm like a naive optimist, but I think that there are within the upper echelons of,
like the 12.
Maybe not the 12.
I think there's some 70. I think there's some 70 who get it, and I've actually heard rumors that I won't go too much into, but like of people who are like, oh yeah, oh thank you Samantha.
So much. Wonderful. Delicious tea.
If you're not breaking the word of wisdom during one of our episodes, it's pointless.
There you go.
That's lovely. All right, so so your spiritual journey, you didn't just say, okay, I'm out of Mormonism, I'm done with God and religion.
Yeah.
There was something still there that you wanted to find.
For me, there's always been a there. I just feel very strongly compelled by religious symbols, by religious myth, by religious history, by religious ritual. And so even like at this point, and we can get into this, at this point I still consider myself a theist. I would call myself an agnostic theist. Doctrinally, I actually think that there's a very, very strong case within the Christian tradition for agnosticism being the appropriate orthodox posture for approaching the divine. I think that as soon as you have some sense of concrete certainty about the nature and the details of divinity, like that's the first clue that you don't have a solid understanding about the nature and the details of divinity. Again, we can explore that if we choose to. But even if I get to the point where I no longer identify with theism, I think that there's so much emotionally and philosophically with religion and religious tradition that like I will always be a religiously motivated individual.
And I think that's why we're having this conversation, because even me as an agnostic atheist, I still look at, and it's hard to, we write things because like ultimately the church isn't what it claims to be, but that's not to say that and even theism isn't usually what it claims to be. In my perspective, it's not at all. But there's something happening there. And when I look at the spiritual experiences of my life, I say, well, that was a really good, positive thing for me. And so I think one of the questions that atheism and just kind of all of us in this postmodern society are going to have to face is, now what? Like, what comes after the decline of religion, of like your typical like fundamentalist, institutional, hierarchical organizations? How do we account for these really positive things? I'm sure you had really positive experiences.
Yeah, definitely.
In the church and after the church. And you say, well, I still want that to be part of my life. And I face that as an atheist, saying, well, how do I harness that? How do I do it? And that's why I love your perspective on things, because it's all evidence-based. And how do we harness the power of religion without, deluding ourselves or exercising unrighteous dominion over people and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So maybe let's just keep the story going, and I'd be interested to hear about some of your spiritual experience, if those aren't too sacred
Sure.
to show us, but just kind of your own spiritual progression, and then maybe tying it in with what you're doing professionally. And I know that's extremely broad.
It's okay. Let's try it.
Just kind of leave it open to you to just kind of go. And
Yeah.
so you're in the church. I'm sure that was really conflicting between, you're finding all these things that are causing this cognitive dissonance, plus being gay, and plus having some sort of valuable religious experience.
Yeah.
So how does that play into your transition, and then where have you gone from there?
Yeah. So because Joseph Smith definitionally is a mystic, like, even if we're going to discount and negate the veracity of the content of his visionary experiences, the fact is that, like, historically and culturally, he positioned himself as a mystic. And so I think that hook was really set deeply inside of me, this idea that we ourselves can have these mystical, self-transcendent mental experiences that can give us insight about the nature of life and the nature of the greater universe, appealed to me so deeply. I think that's one of the reasons why I ventured after Mormonism into Catholicism, into Eastern Orthodoxy, because you have really, really fantastic mystics all throughout the Christian tradition. Julian of Norwich is a classic example. Her famous visions where she saw God holding the entirety of the universe like a walnut in God's hand, and just had this overwhelming sense of hope that she articulated with the mantra, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. Then you have, moving forward, like early church matriarchs and early church patriarchs, especially like the desert church mothers and fathers, who had these really intense visions about the potential for humanity to create what we would call as paradise on earth. And so even for me, in a humanist point of view, those types of very profound and transcendent visions and aspirations for what my nature can become and for what communities can create, and really ambitiously what global societies could crystallize and become, still speak to me very, very profoundly. So Joseph Smith, mysticism, personal revelation. I think that one of the things that is interesting is the self-fulfilling nature of mystical expectations. And so this gets into some pretty deep philosophy, both with philosophy of language as well as philosophy of mind. That the schema, in other words, the mental set of representations that we have for the way that we expect life to unfold, becomes self-fulfilling in the way that life actually does unfold.
Right.
And so you see this both at individual levels as well as cultural levels, where if you have this high expectation for visionary experience, then that individual or that culture tend to actually have visionary experiences. Whereas, on the opposite side of things, if there's at an individual or collective cultural level a low expectation, or kind of this antagonistic sensibility about self-transcendence, about spirituality, about mysticism, well, then those types of experiences tend to not happen for that individual or within that culture. And so some of my own curiosities, and this is quite tangential to the scientific research that I'm doing, but some of the philosophical curiosities that I have are whether it's possible for secular humanist culture to accommodate contemplative practice and contemplative experience in such a way that you can kind of have it all. That you can have your rational secularism and at the same time have these very profound, imaginative, visionary experiences that can be very powerful in the shaping of one's identity, as well as ultimately be for the greater good of the societies in which we participate.
And I think that's exactly where our intersection is because that's what I want. Is I've had these really valuable, profound, and enriching life experiences through religion that I want to maintain as a secular atheist. And so it's like, how do I do that? And I think, like you said, is that it can be, you can have it all, or at least that's what it seems like in my experimentation of things I said this yesterday in a video, that I love immersing myself in a sort of religious experience, both because I derive something from it, but I also get the joy of debunking it at the same time, or at least figuring out what's happening in my brain.
Right, understanding the mechanism that's giving rise to the experience.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's fascinating, and ultimately what you're talking about of philosophy of language, philosophy of thought, and I think that's what religion has done, is that it's really we shaped religion, and religion shaped us in return, and it really does kind of harness all of mankind's deepest aspirations. So I feel like even concepts like, I go back to Joseph Smith, and he really had a lot of things going for him, and even if you don't take it literally, there's something in the symbolism that's very profound. The religious ideas of like Zion, I still believe in that. I don't talk about it in the same terms, because to me it's a technological thing. It's transhumanism and post-scarcity, and that's the language I use.
I like that, post-scarcity.
Yeah, but it's still something that has been expressed by this mystical religious experience. I'm just giving a more accurate, updated language for it. Okay, so of course we had a memory card issue which cut us off.
The sealed portion will never be revealed.
We had just unraveled the mysteries of the universe, and now they're lost to the ages.
Forever. And
so we're going to try to recap some of what we lost.
But we'll make the small plates highlight real, if you will.
That's right. So we'd just been talking about language, and I had mentioned that I considered physics and sort of this language of the Enlightenment, of science and logic, as an updated language of our understanding of the universe and things, and you were bringing up that you felt that was somewhat limited.
It is. I think that we've actually lost some aspects of reality by relying so exclusively on technical concepts for our world and for our relationship with our world. And just, one example, I think, is the sense of appropriate responsibility that we have with our natural environments, by thinking about them in terms of these technical accumulations of resources that are ours to exploit and to manipulate. It's like, if we do think about our environments as having, and I mean this very metaphorically, I mean this very aesthetically, so please don't freak out, all of the secular atheist watchers. But
we've already had this argument in a different video.
But if we think about our relationship with Mother Earth, or with the spirit of the earth, or if we personify it sufficiently to have a sense of empathy for the living systems in which we participate as humans, I actually think that there's something more accurate, more true about that type of model for our relationship with our natural environments than just a purely technical, scientific, factive depiction of our environments and the way that we relate to them.
Okay, so my view of religion has obviously shifted dramatically within the last couple of years. But at its base level, what I consider religion to be as a secular atheist is just the embodiment of my highest ideals and the things in my life that I see it kind of as a duality. There's the things that make life able to happen, whether it's business, making money, doing these different things, exercising and eating. But then there's another side, which is the creative and the communal and the idealistic parts of that. And so all of that side is what I consider to be religion. And so I think that kind of attitude toward the environment and toward other people, even as an atheist, falls under my umbrella of religion, and something that we can use the power of religious thought, the ways that our brains have already evolved to think, in order to push for these good things in society.
That's right, yeah. I think that the one thing that definitely differentiates religion or religious thought is some concept of the sacred. And that can be completely open-ended. That can be totally subject to individual creative constructions. What to you, dear watcher, is sacred? To me, human relationships are sacred. To me, human experience is sacred. To me, nature is sacred. That like I truly feel a sense of wonder and awe and reverence for the sacred nature of so many aspects of my otherwise mundane life. So this goes off into a couple of different directions. Like, first let's go with Plato, then let's go with neuroscience.
Let's do it.
Okay, so Plato has this really wonderful thought experiment that he refers to as the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro. Euthyphro.
You win the spelling bee.
Yay. So in the Euthyphro...
Now use it in a sentence.
Now use it in a sentence. I'll use it in an allegory. How about that?
There we go.
So Plato asks a question about the nature of the gods. And Plato asks whether the gods have their divine power because it's just intrinsically part of their nature, or whether the gods derive their divine power by complying and obeying with sets of principles and laws that are greater than themselves. You know, and I think that if we take that view, that like, oh, well, what if we take the perspective that any hypothetical or imagined deities are deities because they themselves are in harmony with principles that are transcendent of their own discrete identities. So if we think about divinity, for example, as incorporating elements of compassion, elements of magnanimity, like you can think of any number of ethics, of virtue ethics, that you would say describe a deity or a divinity that is worthy of reverence and of adoration. Then it begs the question, well, why can't we embody those elements of divine nature? Like, why can't we embrain, or in other words, like, actually have a neural plastic encoding of these virtue ethics that we would ascribe philosophically to a divine nature, and in non-trivial ways start to incarnate or embody the divine nature ourselves?
And I think that that's completely possible, and it's just how it will be, moving on from in like this post-atheistic society, is how do we harness that for those things? Like all these things that you're saying, I see as reality. Earlier I mentioned post-scarcity. To me, that's Zion and transhumanism. That's becoming gods. That's what we as Mormons always believed we'd be doing. But we're doing it in, it's a little different language that we're using, but it's the same thing that's happening, and using the same sort of cerebral processes.
Yeah, and I think that a huge difference as well is that we're not deferring to external authorities. That we're saying, no, this is something that comes from our own capacity to recognize and to discern truth, to discern virtue, and to have the locus of authority be within the individual. Like that's a radical shift from institutional or organized religion, and from the power hierarchies that I think are the kernel of so much oppression and abuse stemming from religion.
So that I'll save this question for later, but I'll allude to it right now. Is what sort of religious practices and structures are going to allow us to enjoy this type of thinking and everything that comes with it, without the problems that have typically been associated with religion. And we'll come back to that.
Yep.
But first, Plato and
now brain. So now to neuroscience. This is also something where there's just individual differences, and we should be okay with those individual differences. If you don't like red wine, I don't lose my shit about that. I'm like, I do, you don't. That's cool. And these are differences that come, you can look at just the raw biological differences as well as experiential, so like socialized differences that make you find a particular perceptual experience pleasurable or not pleasurable. That it's like you just might have taste buds that don't have a good vibe with, I don't mean vibe. I'm just trying to like really simplify all the technicalities of biochemical reactions that result in like pleasure and taste. But you just might not, like, at a biological level,
have good taste.
You just might not have good taste, Tanner. And it's not your fault. It's just the way it is. But there are just individual differences in preference. And so, like, for me, like, my brain gets really juiced up by like the artistic representations of divinity and by like the sense of the sacred and wonderment and awe. And I just have like a really sensitive dopaminergic reward system to that kind of stimuli.
Same, because we were created to be that kind of Mormon, right? Like,
Totally.
That's part of our organic programming. Like, I loved the deep doctrines and things growing up, and now, like, I still enjoy it, you know?
Totally.
Of finding how it connects with the natural world and putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. It's still a really rewarding thing to me. And it's not for everybody. This interview isn't going to be for everyone. There's going to be people who never liked the religious experience.
That's right. If you don't like religion, it's totally okay.
It's totally fine. But for those of us who do,
right? I think that, and I find a lot of ex-Mormons are like, there was something that I felt in the temple that like really was so pleasurable and meaningful, and I want that. And they don't know like where that is anymore, and they assume that they can't have that. And I guess my good news is like you can have that.
Yeah.
Like there are many ways where that expression of symbol, mystery, ritual can be found in ways that don't make you turn off your analytical rational processes in order to experience it.
Right. So neuroscience.
So neuroscience, this is a good segue into the study that we did when I was a graduate student
perfect, yeah.
at the University of Utah. So we refer to our project as the Religious Brain Project. We started looking at LDS returned missionaries. Eventually, we will expand to look, for example, at Catholics when they're having ecstatic rosary experiences, or Muslims when they report to be feeling the presence of Allah and being connected to God, and asking questions about, do these varieties of religious traditions ultimately tap into a common set of neural processes? You know, that's an open question right now scientifically, and one that I'm very motivated to answer over the course of my research career. Within the Mormon population, we recruited through the Deseret News, so we invited returned LDS missionaries to participate in psychometric testing. So this was like a 2 to 3 hour battery of psychological questions that assessed cognitive style, so how abstract of a thinker are you versus concrete of a thinker are you, moral cognitive preferences, so whether you're more inclined toward purity or loyalty or authority or fairness or aversion to harm, as far as like your basis for what seems good and what you make moral decisions based upon. Questions regarding religious habits, the nature of their prayer life, scriptural habits. I'll also say that in order to qualify for the study, that these individuals had to report that they read their scriptures on a daily basis, that they attend church services on a weekly basis. We had really highly religiously motivated individuals, so these were folks who even said that they attend the temple on a weekly basis, not just your like run-of-the-mill monthly temple.
I could have been in your study.
Totally could have been in our study. You totally could have been in our study. And we had people who were really excited to participate. That's the thing that was also like pleasantly surprising, is that these individuals were motivated to help us understand scientifically what it was that was occurring in their brains when they were having these peak religious and spiritual experiences. There wasn't a sense of... They weren't
worried about being...
Right, that there wasn't a sense like, those evil scientists are just trying to prove that religion is bunkus. It's like, no. There was a really nice cooperative dynamic between the study participants and the researchers.
Science was going to prove that Mormonism is true.
Exactly.
As it always does.
So when individuals came into the laboratory for a brain scan, we had them go inside of the scanner. So like, if you've never seen an MRI machine, just do a Google image search, MRI, you'll see that it's a huge machine. It's got like this round magnet that like people were, so they're lying on the gurney, sort of, like they're lying on the plank, and then like they go inside of the magnet,
in and out of the magnet.
Right, they go in and out of the magnet until they're like stimulated to have like this like religiously orgasmic experience. That's not how it works. So they go in, and this does look totally sexual, but it also looks accurate. I'm going to put my hands right here now as I'm talking and just let you do a Google image search for MRI machines. And but while they're inside of the magnet, they have a screen So they're laying back, they're looking up at a screen, so they're able to read scriptures, like we put Book of Mormon passages on there on the screen. They're able to watch general conference videos. They also have earphones on, so noise-canceling earphones that are also providing an audio feed. And so for all intents and purposes, the environment, even though it's inside of this like really large, noisy piece of laboratory equipment, with the noise cancellation headphones, with the video screen, with the audio feed, they're having experiences that are pretty what we call ecologically valid, or in other words, that it corresponds to a worship or a devotional practice in their normal day-to-day life. When our first participant went into the scanner and reported that they were feeling the Spirit, that was really exciting, because we weren't sure whether we'd be able to recreate enough of a safe spiritual environment for these individuals to have the religious feelings that we wanted to study.
Did you tell them the lab was dedicated? So
we did. We were like, we have did like
we've anointed.
Oh God, hear the words of the lab. Yeah, we didn't do that actually. But we did have them like put a button box on their chest, so they were able to push a button. I mean, the design is so straightforward that like cool. It's really elegant in that regard, where it's like they literally pushed a button when they were feeling the Spirit, and then we were able to go back, look at those moments in time when they reported to be feeling the Spirit, and determine what was happening uniquely in the brain at those periods of time that was not happening in the brain during other periods of time. And you can watch, I gave a whole TED talk on this where I go into it in a lot more eloquent detail. The quick and dirty of it is that 3 of the major brain regions that are activated preferentially when Mormons report to be feeling the Holy Ghost are the nucleus accumbens, so a region in the subcortex of the brain. It's the reward center of the brain. It releases dopamine, which is the reward molecule, in addition to a bunch of other biochemicals. So the nucleus accumbens, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is like right in the midline of the front part of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is the most sophisticated neural tissue. It's the most recently evolved in humans, and it processes things like your concept of your own personhood, your values. It's a region of the brain that preferentially manages self-referential thought. So when you're in a contemplative mode, this is a region of the brain that you would expect to be activated. And then in conjunction with those 2 regions, the nucleus accumbens, the medial prefrontal cortex, we also saw activation within the frontal attention regions, which likely are amplifying the phenomenological, or in other words, the affective component of the religious experience. So like turning up the volume knob, if you will, to where like now these feelings, instead of being really subtle, are very expansive and very pronounced. And that's likely due, at least in part, to the frontal attention regions coming online and saying, focus on what's happening here. This is important.
Interesting. Do you think in a more natural environment, like in the temple or in the church, that those effects would be even more amplified? Because there's just even more factors lending itself to that experience?
Possibly. It's interesting where with humans and with human mental activity, when you're asking a human to report on their mental activity, you intrinsically change the mental activity. And so it could actually be that because of the laboratory conditions where we're asking these individuals to pay focused attention to their spiritual feelings and to be aware enough of their spiritual feelings to be able to report on them, like that in and of itself, that request by the scientist could actually have an amplification effect that you don't necessarily see in a setting like the temple or someplace where you're not being actively asked to report on the feelings that you're having.
Interesting. That's cool.
But, I mean, in order to answer that definitively, we need to put, like, little neural headsets on people as they go through the temple, which I would love to do.
Oh, yeah.
You can, like, hook up like one of those like baker's hats with like sensors underneath of it. So
and it's already got like a wire chain.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the wherewithal is there.
It's perfect. It's made for this.
Or we can just start our own religion, where like we have our own temple that people come to.
There you go. And you
like,
can just do research.
The Temple of Science. Yeah.
The Temple of Science.
The Temple of Science. Trademarked. We trademarked that.
You heard it here first.
So one of the things that was beautiful was to actually observe as well the behavioral and the cognitive effects of feeling the Spirit. And I have to be honest that the cognitive and the behavioral effects of feeling the Holy Ghost were the exact opposite of what I anticipated.
Really?
They were. As part of the study design, we had participants rank spiritual teachings and tell us how meaningful a set of spiritual teachings were, and also how strongly they were feeling the Spirit as they read each of these teachings. So on that screen they would see a quote, and then they would see next to the quote the person who made the statement. And quotes either came from 3 in-group leaders, so either Dieter Uchtdorf, Jeffrey Holland, or Thomas Monson, or the quotes came from 3 out-group leaders, so Billy Graham, Desmond Tutu, or Pope Francis. Here was the trick though, is that none of the quotes came from the attributed sources. That all of the quotes were actually just like generic Christian statements by C.S. Lewis.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's great.
And so what we were really assessing was the power of social cognitive bias. Mm-hmm. When you think that a teaching is coming from your in-group authority leader, are you more disposed to say that this is very meaningful and I'm feeling the Spirit so strongly? And as one might predict, that there was a very, very pronounced authority bias, where if a believing Latter-day Saint was told that this statement is from Jeffrey Holland, then they reported to feel the Spirit very strongly, and they reported that this was very meaningful. Whereas if that same quote, in a different trial, because they were randomized in order to control for the content of the quotes themselves, if that same quote popped up for another person, and they were told that that was from Pope Francis, that they rated it as being less meaningful.
Wow.
And they felt the Spirit less strongly from it.
Wow.
And here's what's crazy too, is that they weren't just fabricating the feelings that they were having. They weren't lying in like a classical sense of deception, based on the fact that their brains were actually responding more intensely as well to the quotes that were coming from an in-group, well, supposedly coming from an in-group authority source. They really were genuinely having a stronger emotional reaction to the quotes that they thought were coming from their own religious leaders. So here, that part wasn't the surprising part. Here's what was the surprising part, is that when we had them do that same task following an extended period of scripture study, of personal prayer, and of watching conference videos, I had predicted that they would be more groupish. I had predicted that after they were reading the Book of Mormon and engaged in personal prayer, that they would show an even greater bias, where it's like that the in-group general authorities would become more spiritually meaningful, and that the statements from out-group authority figures would become decreasingly meaningful and less evocative of spiritual emotion. But it was the opposite, that after participants were engaged in prayer, were reading the Book of Mormon, that their ratings of the out-group actually elevated and started to come into the same range as the reports of meaningfulness and of emotional response as those from the in-group. Mm-hmm. So, from this particular study at least, it indicates that, at least within an LDS believing population, that after they go through a period of personal religious devotion, that they actually become more generous to people outside of their religious tribe. Interesting.
I think that has a lot of really fascinating implications, and it'll be really cool to see how that, line of study progresses and what it reveals about the religious experience.
Definitely, and I will, again, just like to be a responsible scientist, I will reiterate that this was a single study result from like a very culturally specific religious population, and I will in future studies be interested to see if a similar effect plays out across religious populations, and if it's robust, or in other words, like if it's a consistent effect that a religious individual connecting to their sources of sacredness results in this openness to outgroup individuals. I actually, because of some really, really wonderful psychology research that's being done looking at attachment and looking at religion and religious psychology through the lenses of attachment theory, my hypothesis now is that we will actually see that religious devotion causes an acute openness to outgroup individuals. That, you know, that tends to contradict some of the antagonistic narratives out there about the nature of religious practice and its effects.
Yeah, I can see that, but to me it kind of confirms the personal experience that I've had with religion, which is I felt like being a good Mormon got me out of Mormonism, and that was part of it, was every time I had this really profound spiritual experience, it was always accompanied by this sort of newfound love and appreciation for everybody. I remember walking down the street and being like, I just want to like hug this stranger and tell them like, you are a wonderful person and I've never met you, but you are a great human being.
And isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Like what if all of us, just like, even if like 10% of our feelings started to be more tilted toward this like openness where we see like the beauty and the worth of all of the humans around us.
By drawing from your own sacred
whatever, by whatever that practice is for you, you know, if, and it, kind of like we were talking about before, like if you have a religious brain that gets stimulated by religious myth and by religious symbols, like go for it. You know, if those feelings of self-transcendence are derived from other types of contemplative practices, go for it. Like I guess that one of the thought experiments that I like to engage is to imagine a society where there was more value placed on what we, you know, loosely can describe as spirituality, which is, I mean, such a huge umbrella term that we could talk about, but in general, like we think of spirituality as sets of practices or sets of beliefs that evoke feelings of awe and wonder and reverence even. And if those just naturally, like, again, even just biased our thought and our behavior by like a 10% increase toward seeing the beauty and the worth of all the people around us, I just have to think that we would have a very different society than we have right now.
And this is, I think, where I come back into that question that I had posed before, which is part of the flip side of that is a sort of susceptibility to manipulation, even if not intended, right?
Yeah.
Because even if a person, you know, has this connection with an authority figure that sparks some sort of religious experience that extends to a sort of human love, well, there still is that connection with the authority figure and a susceptibility to whatever they're saying and a reiteration of them as an authority figure. So as far as your personal practices with you know, this loosely defined spirituality, how do you reap the benefits without either reaping or sowing the sort of dangerous elements of religious psychology?
Well, and this is something that to me is such a paradox about the Christian tradition generally, and I'll limit kind of my commentary to the Christian tradition just because it's what I'm familiar with. It's not in any way to like privilege Christianity or prioritize it. It's just like it's just what I know. Like it would be silly to be like pontificating about the Muslim religious paradox. But within Christianity, like doctrinally, the person of Jesus came in order to be iconoclastic, or in other words, to like overturn the authority structures that were in place. And like the persistent message throughout Christian texts, or at least throughout like the New Testament, is one of the direct connection of the individual human with the divine source. To the degree to which, like in a lot of traditions, they talk about the indwelling of God. You know, even within Catholicism, which is like an extremely hierarchical religious institution, you have the theology of the primacy of conscience. That like an individual's conscience and sense of the divine will trumps that bitch, where it's like that it trumps the authority structures that might indicate a different direction than the own conscience of the individual.
The kingdom of God is within you.
The kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is within you. Like, yes, that there's such a rich theology and doctrine within the Christian tradition of the individual's direct access to the divine, that like it is this like ongoing puzzle to solve that, you know, I think draws on anthropology, I think draws on psychology, to answer the question of why are humans so willing to relinquish their personal responsibility and their agentic capacity to authorities outside of their own personhood. Like that's just like a fundamental human problem. To wrap up here, I guess my invitation for folks who have been understandably turned off by religious thought is to consider the possibility that there may be really meaningful contemporary systems for considering these principles that we refer to as, you know, divinity, and to model them in ways that can actually enhance our own experience of life, that can bring us to places of increased wisdom, of increased creativity, of increased personal virtue. And those are things that just make our own lives better. There's like a high degree of enlightened self-interest at play here for enhancing our own human condition. That this isn't about like, let's kowtow to an institution, let's defer to authority figures outside of ourselves for the purpose of serving some kind of organization. I think that we're going to see, again, to reiterate, that we're going to see an integration of human sciences, so social, psychological, neurosciences, with religious traditions in ways that help us to extract the good things that contribute to human wellness while leaving behind some of the dross. That there'll be a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap, if you will.
Perfect. And I share a very similar vision, and you know, we kind of approach it from two different angles, but heading in the same direction, I feel, and I really am hopeful and excited because this is sort of a new element of my journey. It was kind of erasing Mormonism, becoming a total nihilist, and then saying, well, if I'm God, then what sorts of practices and things will most enrich my life? Because I'm not planning on dying anytime soon, so you gotta make life worth living.
And if you're a transhumanist, maybe not for a long time.
Maybe not. There you go. So how do we do that, and how do we do it together? And so I look forward to that journey, my own, and seeing how that happens on a larger scale. And I'm looking forward for your work. I mean, I think you're doing really cool things, and looking forward to collaborating. I can't wait for you to hire me on as an assistant. You heard it here. He promised me a job.
It's on camera. It has to happen.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Tanner. Thanks for having me on. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
See ya.